It's Major Label Debut, the podcast about major label debuts. I am Graham Wright. Now, if you've ever told your parents or your teachers that you want to be in a band for your job, you probably know that it's not generally perceived as a steady career. Certainly not the kind of thing that you want to count on long term. Now, of course, we know that it is possible to make a lifelong living off rock and roll. The typical method, the one weird trick they don't want you to know about, is simply to be a generationally successful diamond-selling superstar. Think of your McCartneys, your Madonnas, your Springsteens, your Swifts. But there is another way. Just ask Colin Newman, singer, guitar player, founding member of Wire. Wire is exactly the kind of band that makes me feel very strange talking about business. They're known for their music, which is correct. It would be too simple to say that they invented post-punk, but if you're having the conversation about who invented post-punk, Wire is coming up in it. Their debut album, Pink Flag, which was also their major label debut on Harvest Records, is one of those rare albums that's universally hailed as landmark and definitive, and one of the even rarer albums that completely lives up to those descriptors. Even before you put it on, you can tell from the cover art that you're in good hands. It's austere, striking, compelling. And then from the first note, it's clear that everything happening on the record is on purpose, by design. The production isn't what you would call ornate, but it's very considered. Every single sound is where it is for a reason. It's evident that care was taken with this album. Yeah, it vibrates with all the youthful energy of your usual debut record, but seldom do you hear that kind of energy applied with such precision. And that's true for more than just Wire's music and Wire's art. Every decision they've made along the way has been based on this clarity of vision. And as you're about to hear, Colin Newman is a man of clear vision, a thoughtful man, a man of integrity. These are not values stereotypically associated with success and longevity in the music business, but Colin and Wire are still going, not only selling out shows all over the world, but still making acclaimed, vital new records and doing it all on their own terms. All of which goes to say, it's a great honor to be joined on the show today by Colin Newman to talk about Pink Flag and Wire's adventures through the music business in general. And then, bonus, as if that weren't enough, partway through, we're lucky enough to be joined by Malka Spigel. Malka's a founding member of Minimal Compact. She's a solo artist, she's a visual artist, and she's also Colin's partner in art and in life. The three of us had just a really fun conversation. We talked about all sorts of music industry, philosophy, and really got into the weeds with it. And I had such a great time talking to both of them, and I think you're going to have a great time hearing it. It's a major label debut double feature, and it starts right now. Colin, hello. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us today and for being such an audio professional. This is the most thorough and well put together sound technology matrix we've had, I think, this entire podcast, and we appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you very much. We can only do our best. I mean, Malka and I have been doing a radio show for, I think it's 4.5 years now, or maybe a bit longer, and we realised after a while that crappy mics sound a bit rubbish. And we've gone through a step change in a way, becoming radio people. You become much, much more aware of all of those things. Intelligibility of speech is really important. If you want people to listen to what you say, you should make it intelligible. And I know there's a great tradition of especially American musicians who basically mumble. So you understand nothing about what they say because they're actually way cooler when they mumble because they haven't got anything to say anyway. That's the cynical view of it. But certainly Malka and I would prefer to be understood, even if people don't always agree with what we say.
And I would think that going back to the Pink Flag and the early Wire records, your diction and your voice are very clear right from the beginning. And I know there were some who accused you of being a bit robotic with the vocal delivery, but was part of the way you chose to sing the songs to make sure that you were understood?
I think that was a conscious kind of decision. First of all, the generation that I belong to of the mid-70s or mid to late 70s British didn't have a lot of interest in sounding American. One or two generations back, I mean, the Rolling Stones, that, you know, they were great, but they were singing about America, or they were singing in kind of quasi-American accents. And that seemed somehow quite wrong. And of course, you can either go for a kind of a cod accent and try and sound like you're whatever. But in the end, if you've got something to say in the words, you better try and make them intelligible. I think that was a kind of a group decision, really. It was, I mean, I ended up fronting it out, but you know, I think in hindsight, it was a very good decision.
I concur. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that sort of rapid transatlantic cultural exchange of rock and roll that was going on in the 60s, especially because that's when you were growing up. And I was wondering in those days, if you remember when it first occurred to you that being in a band was something you might want to do.
Yeah, more or less from the beginning. I mean, I was one of those really, really annoying kids I knew all of the bands. I knew, and I had very, very strong views about music, about what I liked in them, certainly what I didn't like. As far as I was concerned, at the age of about 8 or 9, there were only two sets of people who got everything right, and that was the Beatles and Motown, and the rest could do with a little help. And, you know, I was going to supply it. I knew absolutely nothing about how music was made, but I thought, you know, I could add all the good twiddly bits they were missing. I mean, the arrogance of youth. But I mean, really, it was a kind of almost all through my teenage years, it was a kind of a fantasy of being in a band. It was the only thing I ever really wanted to do. And yeah, it was a kind of a weird thing because that, you know, meeting the reality of the time. You know, I remember going to a career guidance. I didn't dare say I want to be in a band. I said I wanted to be an artist. And the person said, "Have you ever thought about garden design?" And I was like, "Yeah, no, you haven't really understood anything about what I'm saying at all." So I just kept quiet after that, you know.
Well, the world probably lost a great garden designer that day, but it gained a great band. So we'll call it square, I suppose. How old were you when you first picked up the guitar?
Okay, I was probably 16. And this is myself and my friend Desmond Simmons, who's unfortunately no longer with us, were fast friends at school. We had a band before there was a band. There was a band that was formed of a group of friends called Tyres. And Desmond was very professional about how he went about it. He got everybody, all of his friends, to record themselves singing over whatever popular song of the time you want to sing with. And only 2 people out of the 10 friends he reckoned were any good at singing, and I was one of them. And I was completely amazed by this. I wasn't really expecting that at all. I couldn't play anything at that time, but you know, I got to be the lead singer of Tyres, which consisted of shouting boogie every now and then. It was, yeah, and the songs were terrible. And it sort of fell apart after not very long, and we started he had a music room in his house, which was quite unusual for the time. His parents were quite enlightened. And there was a piano and there was a stereo, and there was sometimes his uncle's organ was there. It had a beatbox in it, and he had guitars. And we used to go around, we used to listen to records, and then he would play the guitar. And to begin with, he would play guitar and I would hit a box like a drum. Desmond was this kind of person who always had these ideas about what he wanted to do. So he suddenly decided that I couldn't be in the band anymore unless I got a guitar. So I basically had to sort of try and get on my dad's good side to get him to buy me a guitar. And he bought me a guitar in the end. So I was the kind of second guitarist. I wasn't very good. To be quite honest, I didn't get that much better, but that's, you know.
What kind of guitar was it?
I've still got it. It's a Suzuki acoustic guitar, which is a copy of a Yamaha, which is a copy of a Martin, on which I've written literally hundreds of songs, including everything that I wrote on Pink Flag.
No kidding. Your very first guitar stayed with you, not just through the beginning of Wire, but are you still using it now? I
don't use it so much. I could use it if I wanted to, but Yeah, I have a lot of other guitars and, sitting in the studio, I mean, we have a lot of tools available to us.
Was there much gear fetishization, maybe is the best way to put it, in those early days when you were first starting? Were people, stroking their chin over Telecaster versus Stratocaster versus SG, or was it more a sense of sort of go down to the store and get what you can afford?
I had no idea, to be quite honest. The first electric guitar I bought was the one that I had for Wire, which was the Ovation Breadwinner, which I got basically because it looked like it was something a bit alien. Didn't look like a proper guitar. It didn't sound that good, but it looked amazing. And I personally never had much in the way of gear fetishism. I think there are people who did, but it wasn't anybody in the circle that I was in. And for the most part, it was like they're just tools. You just use it for making the noise that you want to make.
It sounds to me you were in Tires and you sort of knew right away that the songs weren't great, and you knew that the bands you were listening to on the radio, maybe a lot of the songs you thought could be better. And I know that even in the early days of Wire, before it was even called Wire, when it was a 5-piece, it seems like you had a pretty clear sense of what was lacking. Is that a fair assessment of how you were sort of moving through music up until that point?
Me personally, yeah, I've always had kind of fairly strong ideas. I mean, yeah, the 5-piece version of Wire was not stellar, but I didn't write any of the songs. There was the point at which I think, I don't want to give myself too much credit, but yeah, I think I basically, once I started writing songs for Wire, I think it took a different direction, but it needed the band to change in order for that dynamic to come about.
And the band seems to have changed almost via an act of God. Your original singer was, am I right that he was swiping an amp and he fell down some stairs and busted his foot?
Yeah, that whole story is just, it's classic. I mean, basically we kicked him out of his own band. People in bands are brutal, especially when they're young and especially when they see the chance of something that could happen. I mean, this is coming on a few years from what I was talking about earlier. I mean, Graham Lewis and I were in a pub called the White Lion in Covent Garden. We were going to the Roxy to see a band called The Damned. And this is quite a famous story. And someone that I'd been at college with, Paul Lowe, was basically on a mission. He just said, George, who was the original kind of leader of the band, he's holding you back. You need to move on. And I mean, it was we'd never had that discussion, typical bunch of blokes, never talked about anything. But he was obviously pushing an open door, because I said, well, I can write songs. I can write better songs than George can write. And Graham said, well, I can write text. And he handed me the text of Lowdown, and that was the very first song that we wrote together.
The time is too short, but never too long, to reach ahead, to project the image, which will in time become a concrete dream.
I guess it was a kind of a moment in time, but once that had happened and, he was out of the picture, having, fallen down a set of stairs and broken his leg while trying to steal somebody's amp.
Instant karma.
Yeah, it was karma. I mean, it just turned out that way. It's like an equally, how to describe it, brutal story is, Pink Floyd just stopped turning up at Syd Barrett's house to pick him up for gigs. So we started rehearsing without him. We realised that even playing his songs, we were better without him. But, we had to have our own material, and that was when, I started writing tunes in earnest for the band.
That's all of you! That's a low down.
What do you remember about the feeling in the room when all of a sudden it was Wire, if not yet by name, then at least by power and spirit? Did it feel like it had just snapped into focus for you?
I think the music snapped into focus because George was very rock and roll, but he was also quite messy in his approach. And suddenly, without him in it, the sound immediately tightened because the songs were really simple, or you all just had to play along in the same beat. And at the beginning, Bruce played the rhythm guitar. And so suddenly we could all stop and start at the same time because the stops were written into the songs. I mean, it was part of the dynamic.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it was kind of obvious. It didn't feel like somebody was missing. It was, I don't know, Paul McCartney said something about the first time they played with George Harrison, or was it Ringo Starr? I can't remember, but that's how it was suddenly the Beatles. I don't think anybody had that precise feeling, but there was a definite sense that this was getting exciting. This was something that was worth pursuing.
There's something about everyone stopping just nice and tight. It was 2 years, I think, before I stopped just bursting into gleeful laughter every single time it happened, ruining the take.
Yeah, stops are great. It's funny, our show went out today and we don't play a lot of old music, but in one kind of slot where we play an older piece, we played I Get Around by the Beach Boys. And I suddenly realised, oh God, that's where I got the stops from. Because it's a song full of stops.
Yes, it is. Bow, get around. That's amazing. I've never thought of it that way before, but that's the beat of the song.
And the single snare hit, then they're vocalizing, single snare hit, and then they're into the rhythm. And it's quite fast as well. It was a bit of a revelation, and you never know where anything comes from. I always thought we should have stops. I love stops. Stops are funny.
Yeah, and it's it's a great trick up your sleeve. When you're at a show and there's a stop and all of a sudden it's silent.
Yeah.
It's, it takes your breath away a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
Were the short songs part of the scheme right away? Was that something that you stumbled onto or something that you sought out?
Okay, so I was at that point living in Leavesden Road, North Watford, and I suddenly realised that what I needed to do was write some material that was definitely not like the material that had gone before. One thing I always hated when I was growing up was 50s rock and roll. I didn't like Elvis Presley. I just, by the time I was old enough to hear music, he was already into a kind of like a phase where it wasn't very interesting. So I thought, well, the problem with a lot of guitar music is that it's still based on that 3-chord trick. And, the format, verse, chorus, guitar solo, chorus out, or whatever it is, third verse and chorus out. I mean, it's so fixed. And even though I absolutely loved the Ramones, I thought, well, they're still using the same kind of devices. They got rid of the guitar solos and they speeded everything up. But it's just like bubblegum surf music. It was definitely owed something quite a lot to the past. I thought, well, it would be really interesting to try and write a kind of music that owes less of a debt to the past and is less American. That in a combination with, for the most part, I was not writing to my own texts. I mean, there are some of my texts in there, but mainly they were either Graham's or Bruce's texts. So I would literally stop the song when the words ran out. Why did the song need to be any longer? It wasn't really a conceptual idea. It was just a response to what I was given, really.
And of course, the shorter the song, the quicker you can get to the stops.
Yeah, quicker you get to the end. Yeah, I think, obviously, Pink Flag distinguished itself by having 21 tracks, which was quite a lot of tracks for, especially if you think about the early 70s. I mean, you could have one piece of music that went on both sides of an album, and suddenly you have an album that's got 21 distinct pieces. That was unusual for the time.
It would be unusual now, maybe in a slightly different way, but I want to get into talking about the music business. And I think that part of what fascinates me so much about how the music business intersects with music is that rock music was invented largely within the context of the business. And so a nice 3.5-minute song that does the chorus the right number of times and, fits nicely on the radio, obviously is something that I love with my entire heart and soul. But listening to a song that instead stops at 45 seconds, 50 seconds feels subversive almost.
Yeah.
It's not radio friendly necessarily, or at least not in the traditional way. What was your awareness of like the business of rock and roll when you were starting Wire? Was it something that you were thinking about, cognizant of, exposed to?
Yeah, I think, well, if you put it in context, because this is about major labels, at the time through the 60s and the 70s, really, there were independent labels, but they tended to be more with specialist kind of music like folk or jazz. There were, in the mid-70s, some labels that would put out sort of punk records, but the problem was is that they put out a single and they wouldn't pay you. That was what we understood anyway. So we thought, okay, we need to go to a bigger label because we want to do an album. So that's how we ended up with EMI. We were also signed by Nick Mobbs, the guy who'd signed the Pink Floyd. That was partly because Wire were referred to in a couple of reviews as the Punk Floyd. We were like a bunch of weirdos within the scene of punk. But in terms of then thinking, yeah, we definitely wanted to subvert the medium. The thing is that it was very, very different time. I mean, the record companies were fairly ruthless and there was a lot of practice going on, which would be regarded as being pretty dubious. But on the other side, there was an element of a gentleman's club about, say, EMI. I mean, they had acts on the label who hadn't really sold records for years, but they were on this label Harvest, the same as us, and some of it was quite out there. And, they just kept putting their records out. They sort of looked after them, and they still had that idea of developing artists by, nurturing them over a period of time. And that started to change at the late 70s, but when we went there, it hadn't changed. I mean, that was something that really changed more very end of the 70s into the 80s. And all of the bands that we liked all subverted. That was what they did. I mean, the Beatles were amazing. So, they subverted everything. We thought it was hilarious, the fact that EMI wanted us to do an edit of Outdoor Miner to make it longer because it wasn't long enough to be a single. That, it didn't fit into the nice 3-minute thing, which is, it's absurd. But I mean, the very, very short songs in Pink Flag were not written for radio. And to be honest, apart from John Peel, there was no radio for a band like us in the late 70s. There was no daytime radio. Daytime radio would not touch someone like Wire with a barge pole in the UK. So there was no point to worry about it. But we were not going to have an easy hit. There were album artists, there were people who could tour and they could sell records by touring. So it was all possible in theory. So, it wasn't something that we cared about too much. But ultimately, we didn't really understand how the business worked. We just understand what we wanted.
Also, Mike Thorne, who produced Pink Flag and other Wire and Colin Newman records, was an A&R man for Harvest, right? A sort of traditional artisan repertoire in the studio.
It was absolutely classic.
With the label, etc.
It was absolutely classic. He was an employee of the label, and he was on a percentage from day one, exactly the same as George Martin. I mean, if you look at that now, from any standpoint, even with major labels, I mean, that doesn't go on. That's totally crazy. It's like a kind of insider trading.
Yes, and there's always, the suits think that they have great ideas for how the record ought to be produced or what repertoire ought to be performed, but they're not quite in the trenches working with the artists to accomplish it.
I mean, the thing was that Mike was, to give him his due, or still is, I mean, he was definitely coming from a fairly left field perspective. I mean, he was into his pop production, but at the same time, I mean, I think he was the first person who played Ligeti to Wire. So, I mean, he wasn't particularly bound by an idea about how the records ought to be made. But in the end, why we fell out was because he ended up coming in from a meeting with EMI where they told him that 154 needed to be just a bunch of singles put together, to which the band just said, F that, Sorry, mate. We'll do some singles, but it's not going to all be singles.
Yeah.
And it was just business as usual.
So it took about 3 records for the shine to go off the apple with EMI, I guess, eh?
I think really that was the point. By 79, really the whole landscape was really starting to change. We were out of the gentleman's club, and I don't know who it was. There were acts that were crossing over to become pop acts who had previously been somehow associated with punk. And Wire were reasonably good looking. We wrote the odd pop song. Why were we not out there being a pop group?
Yeah, they'll look at you with just utter befuddlement, right? You could be out there being a pop group, so why would you ever not do that?
Yeah, it's very hard to remember precisely how it was. It just seemed, every band has a collective consciousness. And really, for the 70s, Wire definitely had its own collective consciousness. And we were pretty much, we're going to do what we're going to do. And sorry, mate, if you don't agree with us, whatever. I guess it was a bit like the indie attitude that was to become more a thing in the 80s, where, independent labels would say the bands, oh, look, we're not going to interfere with anything. You know best about how to do it. So EMI did try to get us to do various things, but nobody took any notice.
So to back up slightly, just to give Pink Flag its due, and I know Pink Flag is often a recipient of its due, but I don't think it could ever have too much. And you demoed the whole record with Mike before you went into AdVision to record it, right? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the whole process was quite long as a process. So there was, the way that we got signed was we did, there were 2 nights of what was called a punk festival, 1st and 2nd of April, 1977, in the Roxy Club. And the EMI leased a mobile. It was Mike's idea, actually, Mike Thorne's idea, to go and record the whole thing as a live album. And really, they were completely invisible. They were in a mobile sitting out on the street recording, and the bands just played. And they had mics in the toilet and everything. I mean, it was all... It was sort of cinema verite kind of thing. But what happened after that was that every band that had been recorded for that then got called in to EMI's A&R department, because some of those bands that were recorded for that album had promise. And it appeared that Wire were one of those bands. But then we had to go through the whole process of kind of proving ourselves. So we ended up doing 3 discrete sets of demos, which we recorded over a period of time, I guess, during the sort of spring and summer of 77, before I think finally signing in August 77. And then we were more or less straight in to record Pink Flag in September.
And was that your first time in, I guess, what you would call a professional recording studio environment?
Apart from recording, the demos were more like 16-track places, but it was the first time we were in a proper 24-track recording studio. And Mike took us around a bunch of studios, and we chose the one we liked the most, and that was AdVision.
Do you remember what appealed about it to you particularly?
The thing I always felt about AdVision looking back, I don't know if the studio still exists. It became an audio-visual studio at one point, and I think it stopped being a recording studio, is that, especially by the time you get to 154, the thing you hear loudest on the records is the room.
Yeah.
That room sounds amazing. And it was something about that space. I don't know, we just we liked the environment. It was great, but the exciting thing, and I think I wasn't the only one who felt that, was not what went on in the playing room, but what went on in the control room. What are those people doing? And that became a fascination.
I'm not surprised that it became a fascination, because, your whole story leading up to this moment, one of the things running throughout it is that it sounds like you knew what you wanted. And you were deliberate about what you were trying to make. And the studio can really reward that kind of deliberation. Was it manna from heaven for you to finally get into a place like this and have access to these tools?
I guess so. I mean, it's like, you attribute consciousness that is not entirely there. I mean, there's will of wanting to do stuff, and combined with youth and, taking opportunities and thinking, just like not necessarily really having a plan, but somehow figuring it out as you go along. Yeah, it was exciting. I mean, yeah, on the first day of recording, this is probably quite a well-known story, on the first day of recording Pink Flag, when they were just spending the time just getting the sounds out of the kit, Mike had the whole band play in the studio because it would have been weird for Rob to play on his own. And he gave us a jar of homegrown, and everybody was completely out of it. And Bruce was convinced they'd recorded the album of us jamming. In fact, all they'd been doing was listening to boom, 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 boom in the control room to get the kick drum sound.
And it is quite the feeling I think many bands know when you do, whether the jam is wonderful or shitty, and you look through the window and you realize that they're completely oblivious to what you've been doing, and they're working on some technical issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but then what was interesting was then methodology. Mike Thorne had studied production. In a way, Wire gave him the chance to do something he'd never done before, to use techniques from pop music in our kind of rock music, from avant-garde music in our kind of rock music. So we mingled a lot of techniques. Guitar layering was something I think came from metal, actually. I mean, right from day one, all the guitars on Pink Flag are all layered. I mean, it's all multiple guitars playing the same part. Layered vocals, which is a pop thing. Being really aware of in a way, the structure of a piece, getting it to work right. But then he had some idea, which is kind of, in some ways, we were a bit ahead of ourselves. I mean, I Feel Mysterious Today, which has ended up on Chairs Missing, was already a song that we were playing when we recorded Pink Flag. And Mike was like, no, that doesn't, it's too different to the rest of the album.
Right.
It's like, I didn't really argue with it at the time. I mean, we just felt happy to record an album. But, you know, if you look back, I don't know what difference it would have made. It was a song without drums for a start.
What about sequencing? You have 21 tracks. You know, the album obviously flows so amazingly. It feels now like it was conceived as one piece. Was it, or how quickly did that running order emerge?
I think that was something I didn't take any part in, to be honest. I think that there might have been some discussion about it. I don't think that there wasn't. I think that we might have had some input into it, but I think that was something that Mike did in the end. I think he had that, like, more of that idea, like it's one thing. That's why I Feel Mysterious Today wasn't on that album.
Yeah.
But it's also, you know, it's also a snapshot. It's a moment in time. Pink Flag contains songs that we were playing at the Roxy in April, and it contains a bunch of songs that were written in between then and when we recorded. That's 5 months. And then by the time, you know, we were playing gigs in November, we were already playing half of Chairs Missing. I mean, it was all going at a very fast pace. So Pink Flag is really just a snapshot in time.
As any record is, I guess. And it's amazing to me how, you know, I've been part of agonized, endless conversations about album sequencing. And what I've learned is the album ends up being sequenced however you do it, and that's the album, and everyone thinks it's perfect and exactly how it ought to be. So,
yeah.
You know, it becomes what it is.
Yeah, I think so. You look for something that works, basically. I've sequenced lots of records since, and yeah, you look for something that satisfies you on some level about something. And, you know, I mean, I sometimes I hear album running orders and I just think, why did you start with the weirdest track on the record?
Yeah.
I don't get that. But then also starting with the most pop one, you're giving it all away in the first song? You know, I mean, it's, and then there's, there are also albums which are not really made as albums.
I knew a producer once who was confident he'd crack the code. He said, you know, there's 3 kinds of songs on a record. There's hits, there's jams, and then there's like weird ones. And every record just has to go like jam, hit, jam, weird, hit, jam. If he was 100% certain, you could just slot everything into that formula. And I don't know, maybe he was onto something. Or maybe he was a nut.
Yeah, maybe he wasn't. Depends on the material, really.
It sure does.
Yeah.
So maybe now is a good time to bring Malka into the conversation. Hi, Malka.
Hello.
I'm assuming that you and Colin met when he worked as a producer on Minimal Compact's record, Raging Souls.
Yeah.
How did you come to choose him to produce that record?
It was kind of random. The record label thought, oh, you should have a proper producer. We were not sure how to find one. So there was like a little book with producers' names.
Wow.
Yeah. And when we came across Colin Newman, we thought, okay, we like the record he produced by Virgin Prunes. We like Wire. Should be good. And that's how it happened.
Where was Minimal Compact at, I guess, creatively at that point? It was your third record. Were you in search of anything? Did you feel like you were on to something? Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Yeah.
Like sometimes you feel like you're going in a direction. Other times you feel like you need a map.
I guess we became more successful. And then you get the pressure within the band and from the outside to grow it.
Yes.
So that's how, they probably thought we should get a producer. And I guess, I don't know. I mean, when you become more successful, it kind of gets in a way of being creative, which doesn't make sense, but that's how it is. So you get less spontaneity and you get more sort of people start saying we should do this or that, which is not the correct way for Minimal Compact because we started from a very pure place.
You have just succinctly summarized exactly the thesis of this whole podcast project.
Awesome.
Tell me more about the purity of starting Minimal Compact. What were you after in those days?
You're not really after. That's the point. You kind of playing together. Get in a room and play. And it's kind of magic, I guess, especially when you're not thinking too much about what you're doing. And so, yeah, there wasn't a lot of process, just playing together. We lived in Amsterdam. We were foreigners. So we had time to just play because, yeah, it wasn't home. It was a way of feeling empowered, I guess.
And it is magic. It is magic. And the thought, as you say, is it can be such an enemy of that. And I guess that's what gets in the way once you realize, oh my God, people are going to hear this music. People are going to buy this record maybe. Oh, well, what would they like?
Yeah, you get feedback. And I mean, it's almost impossible to keep the purity. It is impossible, actually. You can't say to yourself, oh, I'm not going to be influenced by anything from the inside or outside. I'm just going to do it the way we started. That's impossible, sadly.
This is the most pretentious thing I think I've ever said, but it just immediately reminds me of the book of Genesis, of Adam and Eve, of the original great sin of humanity to eat the apple and gain self-awareness. And look what's come of it now.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to it, definitely. I mean, lots of processes get corrupt, I guess, when you think too much or you too influence, I guess. I mean, I guess I found a way to keep purity by never learning anything, which I get in trouble for because I don't know. I played the bass for how long?
I don't know. You know how long you've been playing the bass for.
Very, very long time. But if Colin said you have to play B or I don't know where it is on the bass. You just find it by listening.
You just use the air.
I should interject that when I first met Malka, she referred to the strings on the bass as the fat one, the thin one, and the other two. But put her on any instrument and have her try and find a part to go with some music that exists already, and she will almost unerringly find something within seconds.
And that's purity right there, right? We were talking about drums and beats and stuff earlier. You were talking about the Beach Boys, and I was thinking, I listen to music from the 50s and 60s sometimes, and I'll realize the drummer is doing something that to my 21st century ears sounds completely absurd, and it's not time, it's not a beat. And instead, it's like a million times more interesting than anything I've heard a rock and roll drummer do since the year 2000.
Yeah.
And it seems like the more you know, just like you're saying, Malka, the more you know what you should be doing, what the right note is, what the right rhythm is. Yeah. And then that puts you in a box right away.
Definitely. And now online, I mean, we're exposed to so much.
Oh my God, yeah.
I don't envy people that starts now because how do you keep it pure?
Yeah, you've got a million experts.
Yeah, and people are successful and more mainstream, more and more. So what I consider mainstream anyway, and that's hard.
So what was your first impression of Colin when you got there on day one to make the record?
He was showing off. He was playing the British guy. He turned up with a briefcase and a big black umbrella and in a suit. So, but he was very silly at the same time. So, yeah, I saw through him within seconds, So, yeah.
Colin, do you remember your first impression of Malka? And parenthetically, do you remember what was in the briefcase?
Yeah, I don't think I had anything very interesting in the briefcase.
An apple core and a newspaper?
Well, to be honest, the first time we met each other, she was just coming down the stairs in Chaussée de Vleugat, where Minimal Compact used to live in Brussels. And she did convey some feelings she felt, but also it was love at first sight on both sides.
I had a boyfriend, so that was a bit complicated, but yeah.
Making a record and falling in love must have been must be like going on a roller coaster.
It was, especially since my boyfriend recruited half of the band to be very hostile.
Ooh.
And we had to finish the album in that vibe. Yeah, it was heavy, intense. As
a producer, Colin, do you have any tools for managing, the vibes of a recording session, especially in a heavy vibe situation like that?
Absolutely not. It was. I don't think Malka and I felt anything that we were in control of anything. It's when those things strike. I mean, the proof of it is we're still together and we're still very much a couple. I mean, it was meant to be. The problem is you're flying in the face of everyone else's expectations of what's going on. And yeah, it wasn't really obvious to me when I first met the band. I guess I didn't have a sense of, I think if they'd have been giving out strong couple vibes, there's no way that anything would have happened.
But it's more intuition, it's more instinctiveness, and there's purity there too, right?
Definitely. I mean, it didn't feel wrong because it was pure. Even though I was hurting my boyfriend and I was messing it up for the band, it just didn't feel wrong.
There's something about collaboration at that level. And needless to say, you two have a closer and more intimate collaboration even than a lot of artistic collaborators. But it's clear from the fact that you kept on collaborating all over the place since then that something happened between the two of you that sort of became the new nucleus of, it sounds like, both of your creative artistic lives. Is that fair to say?
Definitely. I mean,
yeah.
We created music quite early on in our relationship. So, yeah, definitely. And we never stopped.
I mean, they used to, Minimal Compact they were in an amazing position for a band we're talking in the mid-'80s now. They had the house where they lived in Brussels, right in the top floor was a room where they borrowed an 8-track and a little mixing board from the record company. 8-track was a big deal at that point. I mean, people would still go into studios and record an 8-track, and they would just spend hours recording all kinds of stuff.
That purity, talking of purity, the stuff we did upstairs was for no purpose. It was for our enjoyment. And it never occurred to us that, we can develop it. It could be the next album, because it was much more experimental. And it was mainly myself and then my boyfriend. We just messed around. He even used to record over everything we did again because we only had one tape. So, I mean, some of it survived and I do like it now when I hear it. It's much more because it's uncalculated kind of music.
And in some ways that kind of set a template for us, because one of the first things that we did as a couple was to buy a Fostex 8-track. And that was something that we were able to record at home on. We didn't own a washing machine or a dishwasher or any of that stuff, but we had an 8-track because we were both musicians. We could spend that money. And so a home recording became really, by the early 80s, we were already recording a lot of stuff at home and working together and figuring out how to make that sound better, how to make it sound more like it was something that had been recorded in a kind of professional recording studio. I mean, you want the purity of ideas and sound, but also you don't want it to sound so covered in hiss and kind of so unclear. Nobody knows what it is that you're doing.
But often people used to say, oh, like in the old days, the demos sound better than the record because they had that purity.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was the idea also, that we wouldn't make demos. We would just record.
Which was quite new for the time, I think.
But the immediacy, the spark and the electricity that's in a home recording is, it's something that we've all struggled to recreate in a quote unquote professional studio environment. And I find, especially with singing, it's just can be really hard to recapture something you did in the comfort of your own home when you're singing into a $12,000 microphone in a $800 a day recording studio, next to some glass.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, that's exactly the mindset that we went into creating a studio and then creating a set of things that we did artistically and a label and everything was like, no, we want to make, if you're making it, you make it. Like Malka's first solo album, which was the first thing we released on Swim. Malka did a lot of the vocals just sitting down, just her head kind of pointed down with the vocal kind of just pointed up into her mouth. I mean, it was completely the wrong way of doing it, but the sound, it enabled her to sing in a way that she hadn't sung before.
And I still like singing this way because singing is kind of intimate, and to do it in a more kind of exposed environment is, it changes things. But the idea of recording at home was so relatively new that somebody wanted me to make an album, but they didn't accept us doing it at home. So we released it ourselves, which started our label.
And was that the first home recorded music that either of you had released at that point?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we did lots of home recording, but released,
Yeah, it was the first thing released. I mean, we already started the studio in Brussels, and that was, through the mid to late 80s and into the early 90s. And then when we moved to London in 92, we actually converted our garage into a studio and put a bit of soundproofing in and bought a decent desk. And it was still basically 8-track, but, we had sequencers that you could sync with the 8-track and stuff like that. It was very much that kind of late 80s, early 90s style of recording. But by some means, we were able to make the kind of records that we wanted to make. And just incrementally, we just built the studio bit by bit to what we wanted it to be.
And it sounds like you built the studio, you built the label Swim, you built the relationship, artistic and personal. And it seems to me, Colin, the first thing we talked about today, I think, was sort of, you were talking about diction, about making yourself understood. And we've come back to that a few times. And it seems like here's this moment of gathering to you not just the means of making the record, but the means of releasing the record and taking over all of these things that are traditionally done by any number of other people and entities and stuff. It must have felt amazing to be getting that kind of control over how you were understood.
Yes, I mean, it's a process. I mean, the first release on Swim was Roche Ballata. We put it out in 93. We got reviews in the NME and the Melody Maker, and we sold a bunch and we made most of the money. And it was like, how hard can that be?
It was easier those days, though, I must say.
Yeah, I mean,
because there wasn't so much stuff out, so you would be noticed. At least people will listen.
Yeah, I mean, it's scroll forward a few number of years, and it is definitely harder. You have to spend more money to put a record out, and you are competing with that whole drive within the major industry to denigrate stuff that's released on indie labels, especially self-release stuff, as being amateur.
We don't have the resources of bigger labels, obviously, so we're competing against people who throw much more money at promotion and everything.
But at least we know that our records sound good.
They do sound good. And I wanted to ask about the technology because, I'm sitting here in my home studio and I'm looking at my trusty Tascam Portastudio 4-track, which when I bought it was already like a nostalgia item.
Huh.
I already had converters. I already had a computer with Logic on it. And I got the 4-track because I wanted to make something that somewhere in my mind was going to be more authentic or more, more direct. It sounds like you've never really fallen into that line of thinking. Like you've been happy to continue embracing the technology as it continues to empower you to make music. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of, I think it's an age thing.
We've been there and done it.
Yeah, you've been there and done it. I mean, achieving sync was extremely hard and then it became really easy. And for a generation of coming in at the point when it's really easy, they don't really understand how hard it was. I mean, a classic example, Olga Suke, Persian Love Song. He could have made it with a sampler in an afternoon. As it was, it probably took him weeks to do it, of splicing tapes and cutting up. It's an amazing result.
Yeah.
And it would be a different result had he done it with a sampler. But
Definitely, because there's random in it. Random is important.
And so using and abusing technology, but there have been points when I've seen technologies come through that have been absolutely life-changing. 1990, the first Cubase, which was the first time you had, it was not even audio, it was timeline MIDI. Just something that everybody is so used to now, they don't even question it. The fact that on the left-hand side is the beginning and on the right-hand side is the end, and you have bar lines marked, and you can divide the beat up between them, and you see it on a grid. This was completely unheard of, and parallel tracks, like the tracks of a tape machine. That was a completely new technology. Nobody had ever visualized digital music like that before. And the next thing was when DigiDesign released the 001 in 2000, or the back end of 1999, first time Pro Tools became affordable for the masses. Pro Tools is absolutely the best because for anyone who understands anything about recording, it's a tape machine and a mixer. That's what it is, apart from the fact that you can see all of the tracks on the tape and what their relationship is to each other. But it's such a simple layout. It doesn't have certain kinds of logic came from being a MIDI sequencer, so it has certain clunkiness to it. And yeah, Pro Tools is perhaps not as fashionable as it was, but it's still, it's just so well spec'd for the simple job of recording. And it's up to you to be creative. It's not up to you to stick something in and sit and get something to mess with it.
And yet it puts me in the mind of what Malka was saying, however facetiously, about maintaining purity by refusing to learn anything. Malka, what's your relationship like with, limitless horizon of Pro Tools technology?
Well, I learned enough to know what you can achieve, and then I let Colin do the technical stuff. So, and it kind of works well between us because he can focus really well, and I can come in and hear something that he might have not heard or come with ideas that he didn't think of. And between us, we kind of complete each other in more than one way.
It's great the way that works between us. And also, I learned everything about how I was not a recording engineer. I still wouldn't call myself a recording engineer, although I take that role. I was taught by Malka's impatience. She just had no time to wait for anything. So I've got to come to a quick solution for everything. So I don't really know how to do anything.
Well, when you play a part, you want it to be recorded.
Yes. Yeah, and Malka still very much put an instrument in her hand, she'll start playing it immediately. And very often the first thing she plays is the thing that's the best, and you better record it straight away.
And with that comes, because obviously sometimes you record it straight away, I know it doesn't sound quite right, or it isn't this, or it isn't that, but you can fix so much. Indeed, you can fix everything to such a degree that you can easily suffocate all the life out of it. How do you navigate the perfectionization impulse, you know, whether it's Beat Detective that makes your drums right, or Melodyne that makes you sing in tune, or any number of quantizations that fix the MIDI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some bands don't know where to start. Some bands don't know where to stop. And it can really, you can spend so much time fixing that you forget to create. And I'm really curious how you guys handle the potential for perfection.
Yeah, I think.
No, we do use the tools. I mean, we're not scared of using the tools.
Yeah. I mean, some friends who are, also in bands who make music, and they always describe me as, they say, oh, yeah, you work on the grid, which is true. I get really confused if I'm not on the grid. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to spend hours editing something to make it sound right. I'll just make sure it all lines up pretty well. It doesn't have to be super tight, but there's something very, very satisfying about a kick and a bass being on exactly the same timing. Certain things just sound really good.
But then you have to use your instinct to balance it. So you bring more mysterious elements, things that are not obvious. And it's a balancing thing. Yeah. Also between us, because you like everything perfect and I want to mess it up more. And between us, we find a good place. Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, that's something that we have really started doing in the last 3 or 4 years, is producing together. It used to be that, I would kind of do mixes and Malka would tell me if it was any good or not. And now she's there kind of pretty much from the beginning of starting to mix something. And, we're just, because she'll say something that will stop me doing a whole load of work I didn't need to do. She'll just say, yeah, but the problem with that is it's just that bit's way too long. So instead of trying to fix it, you just cut it out,
Do your different projects have different balances between the perfection and whatever the opposite of perfection is? Like, do you know when you're doing an Immersion record, it's going to have a different relationship between technical correctness than if you were making a Githead record or whatever it might be? How do you know what falls into each project's boxes?
It's the same, really, I would say. We use our kind of instinct and get to a place where we're happy. That's how it works, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think obviously Immersion now, we're doing so much collaborating, and, even there's new Immersion material, which we were performing back end of last year on our first UK tour, that will actually result in an album we're releasing later this year before another UK tour. There's vocals in it now. There's vocals and guitars in a way that there wouldn't have been 10 years ago. I just think it's all developing. And then, Githead is a band. You have to respect the band. You have to respect the input of the individuals. So there's certain directions you won't take. I know some people are quite conceptual about how, this band has to be like this and this band has to be like this. And I don't think we really think like that. We just try and do the best thing, really.
It's instinctive again.
Yeah.
So are you referring to the third Nanocluster record that you did in collaboration with Sus, or is there another Immersion record coming after that?
No, I'm talking about another one.
The one which doesn't involve other people.
The one that doesn't involve other people, yeah.
As far as we know, we might invite someone to be guest, but it's an Immersion album.
Yeah. Now, obviously the Immersion album with Sus is already done, and we're just about to go on tour with it, which is kind of crazy that we would get that far with Nanocluster, that suddenly we're touring America with it. It was just a crazy idea we had for
crazy idea, and now it's reality.
Yeah,
better be good.
Yeah.
What was the crazy idea as an idea before it became reality?
Collaborating is already crazy because you invite people to throw ideas at each other and try and come to a place and then mix it, and you take a risk. It might not work, they might not like it, you might not agree, so that's a risk already. And then going on tour with people you didn't physically ever met, playing a record you created between you have to bring it into a live sounding record. So it's all crazy, but we quite like crazy, don't we?
I think we do. Sometimes it gets. The original Nanocluster thing was just a night that we were doing in Brighton.
Okay.
Here in Brighton, that we would, it started off with people that we knew. we would play a set and they would play a set, and then we would play a set of collaborative material that we'd worked up in the preceding days. And the idea is the collaborative set would always sound like a band you never heard before, but consisting of elements of the people that were there.
And then we recorded the rehearsals, and that became the album. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was, and we gradually got to the idea that, yeah, that's all very well, but putting out an album after all of the performances have taken place, how do you promote the album? So you can't take it on tour because...
It's more that it was very unflexible idea. You have to do it this way, and because you deal with other artists, you have to be open to other ways of doing it. But it's a similar formula where you send each other quite small abstract ideas and you build on each other's ideas gradually.
It strikes me how great it must be, and I know it's also a ton of work and there's pains in the ass from every which direction, but to have the label, to have the means of releasing this music means that all of this talking we're doing is about what you're doing with other musicians. It's not about how you handled it with the money people or with the marketing people or with the A&R person. It's just you're worrying about collaborating with musicians, and that must be such a nicer way to do it. Not to mention more expedient. I'm sure it would have added years to the process if you'd had some highfalutin label in the mix.
Although that means that we have to worry about all the details of releasing it, which is a lot of pressure.
It is a lot of pressure, and of course, it's a small question of money.
Yes.
But the freedom is amazing, and more artists should self-release. I think self-releasing should be a normal within the music industry. And
it's not easy for everyone.
It isn't easy for everyone, but certainly in the digital age, to get something out without having anybody else involved is technically possible. And some artists are very good at promoting themselves. They don't need a label.
So digital only, because physical, it costs money.
But you could get to a point where if you were successful enough, then you would naturally find a partner to do physical with, or someone, or you would just learn how to manufacture it. I don't know. I just feel like the industry is pretty medieval in terms of how artists are treated, and not just major labels. There's plenty of independent labels who have no better moral scruples than major labels.
It's more of a struggle now for everyone, so there's more pressure. And then people start behaving in an immoral way, in a way, because of pressure, of financial pressure, I guess.
And there's just such a lot of money being made out of essentially digital music, especially back catalogue, artists that aren't really getting paid. If we have another 3 hours, I could go into all this, but I mean, we're already been talking for hours, so maybe this is not the time and the place to do it. But believe me, this world is not very beautiful. And I would say, as opposed to the late 70s where major labels were just sort of general capitalists and the same as, just as bad as any other general capitalist, now major labels are pretty evil. Their intent is ultimately they want AI artists that they don't have to pay. And, and to sort of somehow denigrate everyone else's music as being somehow amateur, so they don't get paid as much for it, so they get better rates out of Spotify or whatever. I mean, it's just all...
I mean, you can't paint everyone with the same brush. It's a bit harsh.
I'm very harsh.
Yeah, but do you have experience with every major label? I'm not saying they're pure
I know
or good.
I know about the behaviour, and I know... I'm enough involved in rights issues and certainly fighting for the bits of Wire catalogue that we don't own.
Yeah.
That they're pretty unscrupulous and they really do not give a flying
The
F.
problem is people signed a contract years ago which is still legal, but it's immoral.
Well, actually, if people have signed a contract to do with vinyl, and their digital is being exploited on the basis of that is actually not legal.
It should be change of law.
But the labels are getting away with it. They're getting away with it because nobody is challenging them.
Yeah.
They position themselves at the gate, right? You know, they say, hey, if you want to be, isn't it great to be in a band? Wouldn't it be cool to be like your favorite band? Well, you can just sign here, come through this door, and don't make trouble, or else we'll replace you with a machine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Greed.
There is a huge amount of greed. There is ultimately, on one level, less money to be made.
But also there's no love of music. Labels used to be run originally by people who are music fans, and they kind of grew into bigger label. I don't think anybody is a music fan. It's all business.
Yeah, absolutely. There are very, the labels that do have some level of morality are ones which are run by people who care about music. But then very often what happens is they go out of business and then the assets get bought by a bigger label who don't care.
Often they sell it, really.
Yeah.
Oh my God. We chose to sell some of our publishing rights early on. We got the dollar signs in our eye. We did the deal. And now once a year, I get an email just from a company I've never heard of that has acquired our catalog as part of, some monstrous deal that includes 1 million songs. And the original company didn't care much about us. And now the 9th new acquirer of the catalog doesn't even know we exist.
Yep.
But they own that part of our music, of our souls, forever.
Yeah.
And they have no incentive to give it back or sell it back or any old thing.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
It's shocking because this is our music. How dare you just take it and do nothing with it and get money for it?
Yeah, and my general view is, especially publishing is a scam.
Yes.
In the 21st century, publishing is a scam. Publishers used to say, well, that guy in the street playing your song, he's collecting money in his hat, but he's not giving you any of it, even though he's playing your song. That world has passed. Digital music, it's all metadata. Everyone just gets paid out automatically, whatever the metadata says. Publishers don't actually do anything at all. They do jack. I'm self-censoring with swearing because I've got no idea where this goes out. But they really, really do nothing. And you have here in this country, MCPS and PRS, who are these companies who are like, oh, we're on the side of the writers, where you get money from us when you won't get money from anyone else. What they don't tell you is they're owned by publishers.
So you know it as a fact.
Oh, yeah, I know that these organizations are run by publishers.
Well, every one of them.
Yeah, and when you get your PRS, I don't know what they call it in Canada, but that's what you get for radio play on the publishing side.
Yes, we call it SOCAN here.
Yeah, the publisher is taking a percentage of that. And that is not, how much that is not revealed anywhere.
Wow. No wonder I don't get much money now.
Yeah.
It's just as dirty a business as everyone has always said, maybe dirtier.
I think it's dirtier now.
I used to, when I was young, I thought, oh, it's not so bad. It can't be all that bad. And then you spend a few decades in it and you realize.
It's dirty, and it is way more dirty now than it was.
And yet you have both managed to carve out this corner of it where you can make music and make art and collaborate and live and thrive. And I'm sure it would be nice if the checks all had an extra 0 or 2 at the end, but you must look at the state of things and feel like you made some great calls, back when you were getting the rights to the early Wire records back when you were starting Swim Records and Pink Flag Records. It must feel good to have it there with you.
Well, I think that's the connection between the beginning of this interview and now. The stark truth is that the fact that Wire owns the master rights, only the master rights, not the publishing, to the first 3 Wire albums or that 70s material, has meant that there is income there for myself and all of the other members of the band that enable us to do anything we want. And so it can subsidize other things.
And not do anything you don't want.
And not do anything you don't want.
That's a very important point.
Yes. I'm glad you said that.
Because you could be out there doing the, Pink Flag played in its entirety anniversary tour every 3 years and making money. You could do that and it would change what that record is and it would change what Wire is. And listen, there's bands that have to do that. You have to pay the bills. You have to feed your kids. But for there to be a band out there that made records that are important to people that doesn't have to do that, I mean, that's really rare and really special and it matters.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that and you appreciate that. That's the reason why Pink Flag has never been released on pink vinyl.
I mean, most people say, why don't you play? They would not understand that playing it is not very Wire thing to do, to play the entire thing.
But I think it in a way, it kind of devalues it because whatever images that conjures up, that doesn't conjure up a bunch of quite old blokes standing on stage who might have a bit of energy, but it's not the same thing. It just isn't, and it can't be.
And it's got a kind of end of career feel to it, doesn't it?
And then you become that band that, you better see them before they're dead. Great.
Yeah. The whole, I go to see my dear father is a trumpet player and a jazz musician, and in his retirement, he plays in a lot of jazz bands, and it's great, and I go see them. But you're in the community center in suburban Ontario, sitting at a round table with cookies and tea, clapping politely to a band playing music that was once vital, sweaty, political, meaningful art, and has evolved into this memory. And, you can see rock and roll starting to trend in the same direction. And
of course.
How does your dad feel about that?
I think he just loves playing the trumpet and he loves the songs. And that's the other thing, right? I sit here all day philosophizing and stroking my chin about it. But then at the end of the day, it is just fun to play songs you like.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the great things about A, being in Brighton, B, doing a radio show, and C, doing stuff like Nana Cluster, is we connect with a lot of different musicians, especially a lot of musicians younger than us. And we're very much, we did an Immersion tour in the UK last November, December, and we're playing that grassroots circuit that a lot of the people we play on our radio show and a lot of the bands we know in Brighton play.
So we play like a young band in smaller clubs because it feels right, and that's the level we can do it.
And that's great for our music because it's from now and it's contemporary. If Wire were doing, playing Pink Flag in, Wigan, 100 capacity club, on a Friday night, that would be depressing.
I would go to the venue in Tunbridge Wells that used to be a toilet, like a public Roman toilet or something, and still has that vibe, to see Pink Flag played through.
Well, thereby hangs the tale. That's the Tunbridge Wells Forum.
Yes.
And the person who originally started that venue is actually the founder of the Music Venues Trust.
Wow.
Yeah, actually, Wire have played there. We did a few underplays in those type of venues. Yeah, so it's got a storied history, that venue. There are some really great small venues in this country. Really great.
There sure are. And it's amazing to tour. I'm Canadian, so you want to go to the next nearby city in Canada, and you're lucky if it's a 5-hour drive.
Yeah.
And having toured in Britain, it's incredible. You drive 40 minutes, so you're in a whole new place with a whole new scene.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that's all. Yeah. Well, I'm completely aware of the situation in Canada. We've done things in Calgary in the past. We curated that Sled Island Festival one year.
Great festival.
And we have a friend who has a radio show there, and she was in Brighton last October, I think, and we kind of took her around and we took her to the various places because we record our show at home, but there are studios and all the rest of it. And she was just amazing. We're walking everywhere and we're covering so much ground by walking. It's like they can't do anything without getting in the car. Just even to go and get a loaf of bread, they have to go, the scale of Britain, but also the scale of a city like Brighton. Brighton is amazing because it's completely walkable. We gave up our car. We don't have a car. We use public transport.
Congratulations.
Because the public transport is so good that we use it all the time.
Oh, that must be nice. And so you live and you work, as you've said, by what feels good. And I salute you. I guess that's what I want to say. By way of bringing this to a conclusion, I could talk for maybe we should do a part 2 at some point where, Colin, I just let you go about labels in the music industry because I would be fascinated to hear it, but I'll spare you today. We have one traditional final question here on the Major Label Debut podcast. I will ask it to each of you individually and also together. And of course, it's the most important question of all. Colin, I'll start by asking what wire was eaten in the studio while you were making Pink Flag.
Seriously?
Seriously. I remember when we did Strange, Mike had this idea we needed to be in a kind of heavy mood. And so we went out and had a curry so we could get in the right mood. And the lights were dimmed when we did the first performance.
Did it work?
No idea. Well, it got the result it got. Whether that was the result of the curry and the lights, I've no idea.
I didn't know curry makes you do heavy stuff. But yeah.
Malka, do you recall when you were making Raging Souls, what you were chowing down on?
I don't know if we ate in the actual studio, but it was the studio we've been using. It was night studio, so we only worked at night, and we go first thing in the morning to this cafe under where we lived, and there it's Brussels. So the guy was amazing cook, and we would have, I can't remember what dishes he made, but
Earth Brouillard, I remember we used to have scrambled eggs. We used to have.
yeah.
And then we started eat steak and chips. We're vegetarian now, but we don't eat it now. But steak and chips we would have.
You would have steak and chips first thing in the morning.
No, not first thing in the morning.
We lived in the night and slept in the daytime. So yeah.
I don't think I have to tell you what an amazing place you've wound up in. And I'm very grateful to you for sharing some of that with us today. And I feel like I've learned a lot and I have a lot to think about. And this is a time in my life when I'm thinking a lot about it. So thank you both so much. Colin Newman, Malka Spigel of Wire, of Minimal Compact, of Githead, of Immersion, of many others. What more can I say? That was inspiring, right? Reassuring. Look, it's easy to feel cynical about the music business, or at least it's easy for me. But Colin and Malka really seem to be doing it, you know? Making meaningful music, immersing themselves in collaboration and creativity and love. To me, that's the dream, and hearing from two people who are living it really brought warmth to this old heart. So I really can't say thanks enough to Colin and Malka for that great conversation and for all of their wisdom and all of their music and their art. And of course, thank you for listening to it. If you're hearing this when it comes out, which is March 2025, Colin and Malka are on tour in the USA with their Immersion project right now. If you check out swimhq.com, there's links to information about that, as well as all their other projects and their weekly radio show, Swimming in Sound. So go there, check that out, click those buttons. Major Label Debut is produced by John Paul Bullock and Josh Hook, and our theme tune is by Greg Alsop. If you like the podcast, please rate it and review it. I think that's like the number one thing that helps us on our path to fame and fortune. And to that end, of course, we're on all the social media apps as well. Just search up Major Label Debut Podcast or go to our website, majorlabeldebut.com, where there's links to everything. I'm going to start doing more social media stuff, I think, so it's a good time to follow. That way you will never miss any of my brilliant insights / stoned ramblings. And that's our show. Major Label Debut will return with more tales from the intersection of art and commerce. So long.